Let's talk about everyone's favourite wine mum in the 42nd millennium, Ahriman. Among the mightiest psykers in the entire setting, at least among humanity, it's Ahriman who is responsible for the Thousand Suns being the semi-sentient clouds of dust that they are in the modern day. But his story starts far earlier than that, when Azek was born on Terra in the days before the Great Crusade began. Born among the wealthy tribes of the Achaemenid Empire, who had allied with the Emperor early during the Unification Wars, Ahriman and his brother Ormuzd were among the first selected for induction into the Legiones Astartes, incidentally making Ahriman among the oldest Marines in the setting, with only Marir Astellan of the Dark Angels potentially being older. Ahriman and Ormuzd are also, apparently, the names of the Zoroastrian deities of light and dark, with Ahriman being the source and embodiment of all evil, which I think is a bit unfair to his 40k counterpart, who is an absolute sweetheart as far as Chaos Space Marines go. Unfortunately for Ahriman and his brother, they were recruited into the Thousand Suns Legion, who, shortly after their expedition into the stars began experiencing the flesh change. Those implanted with the gene seed of Magnus the Red almost always manifested some level of psychic ability. Unfortunately, this came with the ever so slight downside of a sudden and extreme transformation into mindless mutated monstrosities. How the Emperor didn't catch this on Terra, I have no idea, but even after its discovery, even he could not cure the Legion, simply hoping that a reunion with their Primarch would eliminate the flaw. Among the many that fell to the change was Ormuzd, and understandably, this hit Ahriman hard and led to him being absolutely terrified of falling to the change himself. He also had Ormuzd's pendant, the twin of his own that had been gifts from their mother, worked into the shoulder guard of his armour in remembrance of his brother, which is adorable and absolutely precious. Though the Legion would successfully be reunited with their Primarch before being completely wiped out, no more than 1,000 battle brothers would remain to meet their dad. Very fittingly, given their name. Interestingly, the Legion was named the Thousand Suns even before this event. A bit weird, but then I suppose that's Tzeentch's modus operandi. Speaking of Tzeentch, Magnus was only able to save what remained of his Legion by making a deal with the Chaos God, a god he truly believed he was more powerful and knowledgeable than, by the way, which will become somewhat of a theme with the Crimson King. During Ahriman's time with the Legion, he would rise to become the Chief Librarian, Captain of the First Fellowship, Commander of the elite Sekhmet Terminators, and the leader of the Corvidae, the Legion's most powerful cult, all simultaneously. Despite this considerable list of accomplishments, we don't have much information about most of Ahriman's life with the Legion. The first record we have of him is during his 5-year stay with the Word-Bearers, which he didn't really enjoy due to their worship of the Emperor as divine. Unfortunately though, he did end up friends with Erebus. He did at least hate Corpheron, so he wasn't a completely awful judge of character, but it has to be said that Ahriman was incredibly naive and far too trusting, which is kind of a theme with the pre-heresy Thousand Suns, come to think of it. Ahriman was also on record as supporting the assignment of remembrances to the Space Marine Legions, hoping that their writings and recordings would allow his brothers to become more familiar with psykers, growing to understand and no longer fear them. A valiant, if ultimately misguided, attempt. During the Agaru campaign, when Magnus and his Legion were having a nice holiday and running an archaeological dig on an Eldar webway gate, Ahriman first met Othair Weirdmake, a Space Marine rune priest. Othair manipulated Ahriman into sharing the secrets of the Thousand Suns with someone who he believed to be a friend, before using what he had learned to testify against the Thousand Suns at the Council of Nicaea. Honestly heartbreaking. Ahriman was so happy to have finally found someone he could share knowledge with, just to have it thrown back in his face. Ahriman viewed the Council of Nicaea as more of a trial of the Thousand Suns than anything else, and his feelings of anger and betrayal were only worsened by the fact that the first person to speak out against his Legion was his supposed friend and ally amongst the wolves. What made him feel even worse, though, was the reveal that Magnus had not only been aware of the Chaos God's existence all along, but had willingly struck a deal with one of them in order to reverse the flesh change. Unsuccessfully, might I add. In typical Magnus fashion, he would later remove remove this knowledge from Ahriman's head before he could figure it out completely. Unfortunately for Magnus, in the wake of his failure to shield Horus from the influence of the Chaos Gods, and his subsequent Kool-Aid manning of the Imperial Palace on Terra, Ahriman would once again figure out that not only had he struck a bargain with Tzeentch in order to save his children, but that he had also prevented Ahriman and the Corvidae from predicting the incoming Space Wolves' assault on their home planet of Prospero. Disgusted with his father's actions, Ahriman would refuse to follow Magnus's orders to stand down and submit to the Space Wolves. "We are the Red Sorcerers of Prospero, damned in the eyes of our fellows, and this is to be how our story ends, in betrayal and bloodshed. No, you may find it nobler to suffer your fate, but I will take arms against it." With that absolute banger of a line, Ahriman turned his legion against the orders of their Primarch and led them in the desperate defense of their homeworld that would later become known as the Burning of Prospero, vowing to restore all the knowledge he knew would be lost in the battle, no matter the cost. It was during the Burning of Prospero that the Flesh Change would come back in full force, turning the Thousand Sons defenders into giant meat monsters left, right and centre, proving to Ahriman that Magnus's little deal with Tzeentch had ultimately failed. At the height of the battle, believing that all was lost and the Space Wolves would raise the planet, Ahriman decided the best course of action was to torture Othair Weirdmake. And honestly, fair enough, I'd have done the same. Dragging the Psyker into the warp to confront him, Ahriman mind-dumped the reality of the situation, showing Othair Horus's betrayal and the setting up of the Thousand Sons and Space Wolves, before casting his soul to be devoured by waiting demons. Having successfully asserted dominance over the Rune Priest, Ahriman chose to simply accept his death at the hands of the Space Wolves' force, although it was at this point that Magnus finally decided to step in to stop his sons from being slaughtered, psychically communicating with Ahriman and teleporting what remained of his legion away from Prospero, even as he got RKO'd by Leman Russ. After the siege of Terra, Ahriman was determined to free himself and his brothers from the threat of the Flesh Change once and for all, using the Book of Magnus to conceive a spell that aimed to do just that. Ahriman's rubric would technically cure the Legion of the Flesh Change, but in doing so would curse them to an arguably worse fate. It turned all the warriors with weaker psychic abilities into mindless automata powered by dust, but greatly amplified the abilities of the rest of the Legion, funneling the power of the warp through those few stable Marines instead. Ahriman was absolutely destroyed by what he had done, and unfortunately for him, Magnus also wasn't exactly thrilled with the fact that most of his Legion could now be defeated by a Hoover, and exiled Ahriman and his cabal from the planet of sorcerers, condemning him to wander the Eye of Terror and beyond in an endless quest to understand the Chaos God Tzeentch. Not exactly an easy quest, I'm sure you'll agree, but it went hand in hand with Ahriman's personal vow to find a cure for what he had done and restore his brothers to life once more. After being exiled, Ahriman worked as a mercenary for various Chaos Lords, eventually posing as a lowly sorcerer within the Cornate warband known as the Harrowing. Unfortunately, Ahriman's true identity would be uncovered by Amon, the Thousand Sons sorcerer who had served as Magnus's mentor and tutor during his childhood on Prospero. Amon had been exiled alongside Ahriman, and sought to gain knowledge of the rubric in order to reverse it and kill his former brothers to ease their pain. Unsure why he would need to kill them after reversing the rubric, but I suppose he at least had a goal to work towards. After his identity had been revealed, Ahriman used his psychic might to slaughter the warband alongside Tolbek, the sorcerer who had recognized him. Infiltrating Amon's warband, Ahriman killed 3 sorcerers before being wounded, imprisoned, and interrogated as to the nature of the rubric, before being rescued by what few allies remained to him. In a duel with Amon, he channeled the rubric through the sorcerer, turning him into dust and taking his armor and warband for himself, renaming it from the Brotherhood of Dust to the Prodigal Sons, and giving their armor a nice psychic makeover from red to blue. Since then, Ahriman and the Prodigal Sons have scoured the galaxy in an endless pursuit of knowledge, with the culmination of their efforts being the second rubric. Using this spell, Ahriman plans to sacrifice his own life in order to renew those of his brothers, but Ahriman isn't allowed to have nice things, and so this failed. The ritual was derailed, and would ultimately be used by another sorcerer in order to restore the shattered Magnus. There was also a whole thing with one rubric being restored, but then those around him spontaneously combusting, but Ahriman reversed that with time travel shenanigans, so it's not really relevant. One particular area of interest for Ahriman is the Black Library, the Eldar's repository of forbidden knowledge, home of the Harlequins and of Kegarak, the only Eldar god currently alive, unshattered, and not tied up in Nurgle's basement. Ahriman actually succeeded in breaking into the library once, stealing a book about how to break into the webway, and making an enemy of basically every single Eldari subfaction in the process, particularly the Harlequins. Speaking of the Eldar, in a little scuffle between the Inari and Ahriman, Ivrain actually managed to undo the rubric on a few Marines mid-combat, restoring them to life for all of 3 seconds before throwing them off of a cliff. Ahriman, and me to be honest, has no idea how she managed to do this, but it showed him that there was in fact a way for him to reverse the rubric, and his efforts thus far hadn't been in vain. I also hope you enjoyed that one moment of the Inari actually winning, because it's all we're ever going to get. Ahriman would be reunited with his dad during the Siege of Fenris, being recalled by Magnus to begrudgingly work alongside him in a mutual effort to exact revenge for the burning of Prospero. During this battle, Ahriman would use his knowledge of the webway to infiltrate the Space Wolves' battle lines, appearing from behind them and catching them by surprise. Beside his Primarch, Ahriman summoned hordes of demons within the Space Wolf fortress known as the Fang, before Magnus used the energies released during the battle to bring the planet of the Sorcerers out of the Eye of Terror and into real space, where it remained in orbit around the burned-out husk of Prospero. Since the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum after the fall of Cadia, Ahriman has become more and more obsessed with the Eldari, particularly of Rain, understandably, and has been growing ever closer to his goal of reversing the rubric, although I doubt he'll ever succeed. Tzeentch isn't exactly known for helping his followers achieve their end goals. So that was Azek Ahriman, his history, current antics, and plans for the future. If you've made it to this far in the video, thank you so much. It really does mean a lot. Like, subscribe, all the rest, and I'll see you in the next video.